developments. Let's get back to the report. Dmitry and Alexander will tell us about how they were trained in practical CI/CD security, how they fixed the bugs where they found some faults. Dmitry and Alexander, over to you. Good afternoon, dear viewers and dear spectators. We are happy to welcome you at our joint presentation, How the Developer May Hack a CI/CD company on the very first day. I would like to tell you how we learned about the CI/CD attacks, how we got trained in that. We came to the company and found such things there, and then made a journey from making good out of that. We learned that from Pavel Sorokin, who is a very well-known hacker. Let me make a reference. If you're interested in that topic, he had a report on CI/CD security. You may continue your training over there. So let me introduce myself. My name is Dmitry Taranenko. I am a cybersecurity director in SberZdorovye. On SberHealth, I'm in charge of the security in the broader sense of that word, in the company in particular. This is the topic that interests me, the safe and secure development, safe operation, and CI/CD. These are the topics that are of my interest, and now we'll have a joint presentation. My name is Aleksandr Televnoy. I'm head DevOps in SberHealth, and I make sure that our systems are easier and better for the developers. Okay, let us start with CI/CD. What CI/CD is about, what we're going to understand as CI/CD in the context of our report. CI/CD, this is a set of practices, approaches. The very essence is that we need changes in our code, and we have to render them somehow to the end user, either for testing or for the development for some purposes. For that, we are using this approach. This notion means the infrastructure of development, which consists of a set of components. All in all, it can look this way. What is important there, as attackers and as defenders, it's important that CI/CD has components that are integrated with each other. In order to make sure that those integrations work, you have to work with the secrets at different stages. Artifacts would be created, and you have to work properly with them to make sure that after the assembly of artifacts, no compromised artifacts are run. This is CI/CD composition. This is the basic set of components. Any CI/CD has a code management system, has a component which is being used to underlie CI/CD, the build and assembly. There is some registry of artifacts. This is where our artifacts have been reposed. And there is secret manager, which stores all our secrets from integration, from surroundings and runtime and orchestration. This is where our applications would end up. There is a link to CNCF pool, and this is what you may use in order to find more information. But for us, this basic scenario is quite enough. Let's have a look at the model of CI/CD threats. There are two types of threats. The developer. There is some abstract developer just an IT specialist,
имеет легитимный доступ для исполнения своих
which has
обязанностей.
a legitimate access in order to perform his functions in CI/CD. It might be DevOps engineer or a tester
Другой специалист, которому нужно
or any other
к какому-то
specialist who has to get access to some repository, group of repositories, or have their own repositories. What goals are there? And
проекты соседних команд.
to impact the projects of adjacent or neighboring teams. If the development platform is being used for several organizations, then he or she may impact the infrastructure of other organizations as well. It is another very important thing that
который скомпрометировал
a criminal may compromise the account, tokens and keys of our developer, and is performing actions on his behalf.
по всей CICD.
An internal
Мы рассмотрим нарушителя, который
violator without access to CI/CD.
CICD, но
This is a user who has no
которые могут позволить такому
access, legitimate access to CI/CD, but there are some misconfigurations
реализовать свои атаки.
that may help such sources of threats
Рассмотрим
come true. Now let's have a look at
примеры.
examples.
Мы сразу после этой вводной ограничим
Immediately after such an introductory, we will limit the scope because CI/CD in our company is built on GitLab and will
угрозы. То есть
discuss the threats which are typical of that. Let's start with the access model.
в GitLab нас интересует
In GitLab, we're interested in the roles of a developer and app. So these are the roles that have access to the projects, to the groups, that may have some personal projects and that may launch pipelines.
также нам важно
Also,
понимание, что пайплайн
for us, it is very important to understand that pipeline maybe
у нас у каждого проекта может быть пайплайн.
every project may have a pipeline. We have some specific pipelines.
Это наша поверхность атаки. Также
This is what might be compromised also in GitLab in order to implement
задания, которые есть в пайплайнах, используют
pipeline to do the task within pipelines. GitLab runners are being used, and this is what we're going to attack.
существует
The GitLab runner attacks is something that we will consider. There are different types of GitLab runners. We will look at Docker and Kubernetes that are most widespread.
Но до этого мы рассмотрим все-таки
But before that, we will still consider
какие негативные последствия
what negative consequences can be entailed by CI/CD vulnerabilities and threats. It is important to understand that IT companies
это шире, чем просто
understand CI/CD broader than just a platform or something that used in order to manage the applications,
процесс разработки.
to
Потому что если такой
develop the
рассматривать, то
software development
угроз
management.
негативные последствия
CI/CD
как будто
threats
влияют только
may impact
разработки. А на самом деле
only the development process, but in essence,
основа бизнеса — это приложение и работа.
applications are the backbone of any IT company,
Допустимые события.
and therefore such threats are intolerable events for an IT company.
В контексте GitLab Runner то,
In
что
the context of GitLab Runner, what we're going to consider
свойственны угрозы, что выполнение произвольного задания,
the performance of some
job, похищение секретов,
code stealing of secrets of the runner
job,
or from
внедрение артефактов
neighboring jobs with implants
полностью.
being made where the whole development can be hijacked.
Мы переходим к самой
Next,
интересной части
we proceed with the most interesting part, my part of the report.
атаки на
We will consider the attacks against Docker Runner,
Runner и на
Kubernetes Runner, and Kubernetes Runner when Docker and Docker is being used.
Docker Runner. В Docker Runner
What Docker Runner is about? Docker Runner
более безопасный раннер, чем Shell. То есть
is a safer and secure runner than Shell. In order to make job,
после
a container would be
погибает,
run. After it is run, it will die, it doesn't impact the host, it leaves no artifacts on the runner host.
Здесь я привел ссылочку, что если у вас
Here I make a link.
упражнение, где вы
If you have such an exercise,
реализовать Docker Runner, то
we have to securely do the
нам
Docker Runner. that would be of interest for you. What is important for us here? In Docker Runner, there would be a mandatory Docker socket so that we could analyze the attack. The scheme would be the following.
У нас на Docker Runner
On Docker Runner,
несколько
we
заданий, несколько
run several tasks, several jobs, and each of them is in separate container. All the containers are unprivileged, and that's good, but as far as we have access to the
из той job,
Docker socket, then from job,
наш
not we,
злоумышленник, он может
but the criminals
обращаться
from that job may get to the socket of the
первое, он
runner
запустить
and first may run a privileged container,
и
make exe file and escape to host node,
соответственно
and
доступ
get access
к другим запущенным контейнерам и
to all other executable containers,
своровать.
and thus stealing secret
Registry, да, чтобы
from registry in order to inject
какой-то плохой образ, да, куда он добавит
some bad image where he would add his malicious code in registry,
и окажется
and this image would be pulled and he would end up
вроде. Второй способ, в принципе,
in Prodi, for instance,
нашему нарушителю
in this environment. Second option, our
совершать побег из контейнера,
criminal not necessarily has to escape from the container. It may turn to API of a Docker, make a list of containers, and make an exe file
доступ
for the container and get access to the secrets being stored.
Далее рассмотрим Kubernetes Runner.
Next,
Они
Kubernetes Runner.
более безопасны, чем Docker.
They are safer than Docker.
Здесь
These are the safest runners. Here,
всё намного лучше, потому что все
everything looks better because all the jobs are working in standalone pods.
о которых мы
But there are some configurations, misconfigurations that we'll speak about that would enable the criminals to penetrate.
наша джоба запускается в поде,
Our job is being run from Java. There is an account service,
происходят какие-то действия, да, то есть
and some actions are done to the rights.
аккаунт.
When our service account, for instance,
В случае, когда у нас deploy runner, то наш сервис
in
аккаунт
case of deploy runner, our service account has
может
more rights
создавать, что-то создавать,
and may
менять ресурсы. И здесь
create something or change the resources. And a situation is possible when our service account
право создавать другие аккаунты,
has the right to create other accounts, and it may create another account and
и получить
compromise the
доступ к
administrative privileges in order to get access to the cluster. And it means that we will get access to all the nodes of the cluster which are doing CI/CD jobs.
когда
And the second option is
когда необходим запуск Docker and Docker.
when you have to launch Docker and Docker. For some cases
Запускать
of testing, you have to launch the containers as service.
здесь ситуация в том, что этот
The problem is
конфигурированный.
this container is always privileged.
GitLab
This is standard specification of GitLab. Docker and Docker
обладает вот этим
runner
контейнером.
may have this privileged container. So it means that
Базовый вот побег из привилегированного контейнера.
the basic escape from privileged container to host node is possible. We can compromise the file system,
Но
and
job
accessible to us are only jobs which have been run on this node.
злоумышленнику, нарушителю, ему интересно
The criminal certainly
все джобы и оказывать
is interested in seeing all the jobs, to impact all the jobs in the whole cluster.
некий
For that, it may look for some daemon set,
деплоится на все ноды и
which has been deployed on all these sets, and this daemon set will have most likely
да, с-
privileged rights. And using them, an escalate might be done to the cluster administrator.
крайний слайд. Здесь я хотел
This was my last slide. I wanted to show to you a kind of threat matrix for CI/CD.
наложенный
Kill chain attack has been added with kill tactics, and they might be of interest for every stage. Proceeding from that matrix, we can come up with the right strategy of security in order to make CI/CD and the platform of development safe and secure, and thus protecting the company from intolerable events that would impact the work of its application. And that I would like to pass the floor to Aleksandr, who will tell you about our experience.
Всем снова привет. Как Дима
Hi everyone. As Dmitry has said, CI/CD really, that's a very important aspect of every company. And you have to follow that, you have to fix it, and you have to check whether there are any vulnerabilities popping up there. Let me tell you more about our trip, how we did that in SberHealth. And in terms of architecture, that's the same, but certain things in terms of the architecture will withhold because of confidentiality. A brief slide, in essence. All the items are there, but in future I will tell you more about each of them.
В первую часть расскажу, что вообще у нас в компании есть. И
First, let me tell you what we have in the company, and we are using GitLab CI/CD, and the biggest problem of GitLab is that the pipeline is the part of the repository. So as far as the pipeline is a part of repository, we can just check them, fix them. Every person has the right of a developer. You may change something, you can use that pipeline in order to run any code in our SDLC project.
мы используем shared-раннеры,
We are using
где происходят все наши сборочные конвейеры.
shared runners,
Нет такого понятия, что
and there is no such a notion that for every project we are building
знаем, что
a dedicated infrastructure. We know that whatever we are assembling and building, this is done in the same cluster.
что мы ожидаем от разработчика. Мы как бы
What we expect from the developer? We streamline, unify all the processes, and this
глобальный инклюд, в котором
a global inclusiveness, which describes all the measures that are needed for 99% of our repositories.
тестирование.
This is whatever we need. It deploys stage names of the project,
Что этот шаблон,
and it looks like this template
мы его используем, безопасный. Мы точно знаем.
is safe if we use that. We know for sure because the changes are being done through mesh request. A separate team will be responsible for its review. But as I said, GitLab, this is just a text file. And for instance, I want to make a feature branch
Логику.
and introduce my own logic there, which would do something different. It would not stop me.
Собственно, больших болячек GitLab в том, что GitLab позволяет нам еще и создавать личные проекты. То есть
GitLab helps us to make our own projects, not the projects where lots of developers would contribute to some initial code. But I personally can create a project and use DLC, and I can delete that project.
нет какого-то
And if we don't have any scanner,
новый созданный
that would automatically scan every new repository. It would go to the gray zone, and it would depend on the speed of the work of such a scanner.
разработчик может запустить весь дел.
What the developer may run within SDLC. In essence, we are blocking internet where
Ему не получится.
you will not be able to run it from the internet. So there are two entry points: Docker registry, which stores the artifacts that we're collecting, that we're using, the source code,
И в
which then goes to production. And in our infrastructure, there is a component which is called proxy registry.
позволяет нам
This is a repository that allows us to launch the images from Docker Hub.
скачать какой-нибудь.
We have scanners and we want to download some image which has a vulnerability with some old libraries, then the scanner would block it.
Соответственно, что у нас еще есть для разработчиков?
What else we have for the developers?
Dev-окружение. И так как dev
We have dev environment.
то нам нужно быстро разрабатывать, быстро
We have to develop that as fast as possible. We have to check our assumptions as fast as possible, and developer has the administrative rights in that cluster
была довольно высокая.
in order to accelerate the development. And
которые у нас есть.
DLC helps us to deploy those applications. We have VPN.
И
This is within that contour, and actually VPN
но
doesn't solve all the problems there, but let me say that
никакого
this is our internal environment with no public access.
И, как я уже сказал, мы тоже
And as I said before, we're also involved in the security, and not only we don't have access to internet,
ограничиваем доступ
but we also limit
то есть
the access to internet.
кластеру продакшн.
If we need access to cluster production, we would open specific cluster. If you need access to Nexus, it will be filtered through firewall.
Кластера сборки такого у нас нет.
So you don't get an unauthorized access to everywhere. Kubernetes helps us to streamline our approaches to SDLC. Shell, Docker runners, what Dmitry told you. We are not actually doing security in Docker. We do that only in Kubernetes. So this is what our system is, and in order to understand the second part, in order to understand what we have to do, we have to make 4 steps in order to get inside our SDLC. First of all, you have to run something, and as far as we are using GitLab CI, the problem is already solved. We have a text file, we can run whatever we want. Second thing, we have to get access to that. And here we can use our imagination in the sense that there are different sophisticated systems of tunneling. You can make a DNS tunnel somewhere to the internet. But in our situation, it's a little bit more interesting. We had some MICASFIC, and therefore we use the standard STP tunnels. Number 3, as far as CSTP jobs are not long-lived, we need a route, depending on where we go, route from node, from cluster, from GitLab. So the more privileges we have, the better. And the item number 4 in our case, that was about checking the security audit, and everything would depend on what our final goal is in terms of that hacking. We act as positive hackers, but in case the goal is some negative, then the consequences might be quite serious. Number 1, this is a private repository case. Any developer, anytime, may create CI/CD, and it would be valid. Here you see that we are running the latest bunt, which works through our proxy, and as a code we're using reverse bash reverse are numerous, and you can use different vulnerabilities, PHP, etc. But as far as we can run a standard bunch repository, this is what we do. IP is private. I will tell you more why. To what port we are getting connected, in essence, this doesn't matter. And here, this is the item that we found. It was one of the reasons why we got it. When we opened access from cluster of assembly to dev cluster, instead of opening access to IP, we opened all the ports. And as I said, developers are administrators. What we only need, we take the code, we assign the privilege mode to that, and in essence, we get our application that is available from SDLC at any portal. Initially, we were in bash CSC of dev cluster, and after we got reverse shell, the last command shows that we are already in the DLC session with privilege, and we see that we in build folder, and hence you can get to another stage to understand what we may get. Okay, first thing, you have to check once you are there in Kubernetes, your capabilities. One command helps us to check. This is a privileged mode in Linux. Even without privileged regimen, a lot can be done. In SDST cluster, you can try to study the opportunities to try to get access to production cluster and access to some repositories. But once we are in the privileged mode, then this is very bad. Why? Because we need only 3 commands in order to get to the file system of the host. We would just make an empty catalog. We would make a virtual file
создавать, менять любые
system, and by means of routing, we can change any files on the host system of Node and Kubernetes.
простого. Мы можем
And
публичный ключ
for instance, we can
закрепиться,
get our public key to SH and
доступен, мы можем
get authorized as a user,
скрипт,
or we can run any cron script,
все.
put that on schedule, and that's it. What we're left with, for instance, if we have 10 nodes in the cluster,
Эту процедуру
then we can that procedure run several times,
запускаем, доступ ко всем.
and this way we will get access to all the nodes of our cluster.
Не смешно? Ну ладно.
Doesn't sound funny? Okay.
Это будет немножко поживее.
I think that you would be more enthusiastic about that.
Все очень плохо.
Well, here everything is very bad. This slide, in essence,
Нашего доклада.
is the backbone of our report,
Если вы владеете
because if you
на SDLC,
have root access to SDLC, in essence,
почему?
you can close your business. Why? Because we can get access, for instance, to, if in SDLC we're using STR form, it means that we have an account which provides us with access to cloud. And as far as we are collecting the
Если у нас есть куб конфиги production,
data, if we have
мы имеем доступ.
configuration to production cluster, it means that we have get access to
Мы можем взять
production and we can
фронтенде, изменить
deploy whatever we need. In front end, we may change part of front end, add some banner, some intergovernmental one or something like that.
много прав
Means that we have so many power
от всей
that in essence these are the keys from all the company, and you cannot separate that. There are certain things that would help us to mitigate those risks, try to mitigate that, separate that, but
который имеет
SDLC, that's a very serious story because it has access to everything, and you have to fix that very fast and do that a safe way.
с нашей
What we did,
первое, что и самое главное,
first thing and most importantly,
режима в Kubernetes.
we abandon privileged mode in Kubernetes. There are lots of tools that help us to collect our containers using
Здесь два
Drupal's regimen. There are two examples, Kanika and BuildKit. In our case, we are using BuildKit because it works better with cache, but between those two products, so there is no
нам
much difference.
давать возможности запускать.
Therefore, no way we run containers with a regimen
Я понимаю,
that may attack the host nodes. Well, there are some cases when such a regimen would be needed. My recommendation is that we have to dedicate that as a separate cluster. You have to control when how is using the privileged mode in Kubernetes. By default, it has to be closed.
как я уже говорил, сами по себе репозитории
Second, as I said, GitLab repositories are being used by many people,
приватных
but this gray zone of private repositories, where I can set up my own repository, experiment, and then erase that. So we just disconnected that, disabled that. If some developer needs some playground, we can do that on our own.
мы можем поставить
And this is manageable. It means that we can set up a robot that would make just the replicas of what is being launched in CI/CD to control that there is no reverse shell.
опять же разделяем раннеры на
Again,
риска. У нас
we divide the runners into risk groups. So you have to be able to
у нас
build, deploy the codes, and different privileges are needed. For instance, the moment of assembly, we need access to
нам нужен доступ в продакшн. Соответственно, если мы технически
one group of features. Test and deploy would
то в случае
require other roles if one of the steps
раскрыт, то есть
is compromised.
к одному из
If the criminal gets access to one of the steps, then the damage would be not so grave. It doesn't solve the problem on its own, but at least we'll be able to get
больше времени
some
с нашей стороны.
more time to react.
И самое простое, самое понятное, то, что все очень
And
делать, это firewall.
the clearest thing, this is about firewall, unfortunately.
Это было
One of the reasons why it was possible,
правильно сформированные политики доступа к dev.
the access to dev cluster policy was not formulated well.
Никто
The ports were not needed for anyone, and no one thought about using them. And at the end of the day, turned out that they can just open any port.
немножко дальше
And sadly,
защитили эту
we
систему.
went further. We protected that system by means of
Сетевой поток
Uber policies. But if the network flow is open, just because
нужно проводить постоянный аудит, контролировать,
you have to do the audit, control that system, control
чтобы это было не
that nothing excessive is opened, that it is safer. And the last thing, recommendation for all of you while we are here,
кибербезопасности именно для инженерного персонала.
and this is a cyber training for the engineers. The people from cybersecurity do a great job, and they apply to us to amend and change our infrastructure. But if an engineer does his work and fails to understand the risk of certain mistakes and faults, I can ask you whether you need a privileged mode in Kubernetes, and everyone would know that. No, this is contrary to the best practices. But some may have that in the infrastructure.
Вроде да, нельзя
But
делать, а что такого?
probably you cannot do that, but
Мы можем просто одной строчкой
why?
полностью открыть нам доступ ко всему. Это не
Just one line in the
инструментарий, это
command line will open an access to everything. This is not
еще что-то.
a GitLab vulnerability. This is just a misconfiguration
Позволяет нам делать все, что угодно.
that may help us to do whatever we want, and such mistakes are considered to be infantile or child diseases.
Более простая ошибка,
But the
ее можно исправить,
simpler the mistake is, the easier it is to correct
в
that.
глазах она кажется.
And the less noticeable it is in our eyes. We made some links
Документы, по которым мы проверили, какие вообще есть возможности эксплуатации тех или иных систем, и рекомендую с ним тоже очень сильно ознакомиться.
our recommendations.
Вернемся к этому слайду. Опять же,
Okay.
очень много про privileges.
We said a lot about privileges. We said a lot about firewall.
Задача отключения
And again,
репозиториев — это не
disabling private repositories, this is not a silver bullet. It means that we have to know what rights we give to the developers so that on the first day we
получили достуp,
don't get access to pipeline to some
которые всем нужны.
basic tools that everyone needs, and
Все, что нам нужно,
sometime later it turns out that we don't need anything more. We're in the root cluster of build,
систем на
separation of systems
тест,
by
какие-то UI-тесты.
test what other features. If we need some tests, then we bring them closer to development in order not to overload the infrastructure, and follow the best practices. There are lots of best practices.
Это нужно,
Try to understand why this or that is needed,
потому что все бы
and understanding all the reasons, best practices.
компании.
This is about the lost data of other companies.
Не только читать истории про то, как
Not only you have to get familiar with the stories of how people lost the data, but you have to check whether you're not making the same mistake.
огромный доклад.
And thank you so much for your attention.
За внимание.
Thank you.
QR-код. И если
That's a QR code.
голосовать за нас, и
And if you want to vote for us or
мы с удовольствием
give any feedback,
ждем ваших вопросов.
and we expect your questions. Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Let me repeat, don't be shy to vote.
Екатерина.
And Ekaterina will read out the questions. Thank you. Thank you, Oleg. We have several questions. Artur asks, what do? We have some external development, and external development can veer. OSS, the third party and counterparties security.
Так как у нас доклад был про CI/CD,
As far as the report was about CI/CD, hence is a question.
разработчики используют собственные,
If the developers are using their own CI/CD and we get artifacts,
нам остается просто их просканировать.
it leaves us only to scan that with the scanner.
Агенты переиспользуют.
If the external counter agents are using our CI/CD, then all the rules for internal development are being applied for
Внешних заказчиков также.
external customers as well.
Спасибо. И еще
Thank
один
you.
вопрос от Артура.
Давайте я дополню первый.
Another question. Let me complement to the first answer.
Первый ответ, там был вопрос, как вот оценить,
How we assess
да, которая внешне
the company,
проводит разработку для
which is external, which is a third one, which does the development. We can ask the questions that we usually come up with.
безопасность в
For
компании.
instance,
Да, то есть на каком она уровне.
does the contractor comply with the cybersecurity rules?
Да,
Whether the engineers who are working that project are trained in cybersecurity?
безопасности соблюдают ли
Are they trained in cybersecurity? Are they following the best practices? What best practices they are following?
это дело,
This is just like when you do that,
о чем поговорить.
you
Если на это
have something to tell them.
ответа, то
If your questions remain unanswered,
чек-лист или оценку не
then probably you can make a checklist.
кажется, что с первых слов можно понять,
Well, it seems that
стоит ли
at first glance you may understand whether you have to continue communication or not.
Как
Okay, next question. How we can assess whether every role is critical, not critical for the product.
Смотрите, здесь
Well, look.
мы рассматривали GitLab, CI/CD.
Here we
У нас
considered GitLabs and CI/CD, and CI/CD is built on that.
есть
In GitLab, we have a set of roles, a role model,
те роли, которые
and the roles
это
that developer and above, these are the roles
нужно уделить внимание. Да, здесь
that need more
важно что
attention. What is important there?
кроме структуры вот проектов в GitLab,
But from GitLab's structure, we have a structure of commands, structure of applications,
команды есть
and every command has a repository in its responsibility area. The right approach is that every repository has to have
владелец, который
one owner
нести ответственность за него,
that would have responsibility for that
в предоставлении прав
and be part of
на этот репозиторий.
handing over rights to that repository. I think that this would be the answer. Let me complement what's been said. GitLab, in essence, is a very primitive role model,
По умолчанию все имеют права.
and by default, everyone has the developer's rights. It means that they can suggest ideas, make requests, and maintainer rights. These are the rights that the team lead should have.
И
This is the person who does the review,
как-то их более гранулярно, сложно.
and it's very difficult to separate them. There is a person who bears responsibility for the initial base, and he takes the decision what components have to be incorporated in the pipeline and code, etc. Okay, thank you.
Может ли
Ivan asks whether developer can work without administrative rights.
Конечно. Ну, типа разработчик.
Yep, the answer is affirmative.
Странно,
The developer works without administrator's rights. It's strange that he eventually has them
что вкладом, то есть мы делаем
with some minimum input.
и получаем
Means that we do some manipulations and we get more rights than is expected.
вопрос? Какие критерии фильтра?
Next question. What criteria of filtration of public Docker images you are using?
Я, короче, скажу так. Мы купили платформу.
Let me put it like that. We bought a platform.
Название какое?
I will not tell you the name. And the magic happens. All the vulnerabilities which are there
Поэтому
are reported to us.
как оно внутри работает, к
So, unfortunately, I do not know how it all
В
works.
выступлении не было рекламных интеграций, поэтому
We're not supposed to make any advertisement,
подключены
but I may say that
да,
we have publicly open feeds
компоненты
that we can use in order to identify the component
вендорские фиды, которые
composition and provide us feeds
в нашей платформе
that have been expanded by its expertise.
выполненный результат.
End of the day, we get some
Сколько времени потребуется?
fuller result. How much time it will take in order to improve the level of information security in CI/CD, and how many people you need for that?
Я, наверное, начну.
Let me start probably by taking that question.
Я в компании продвигаю такой подход.
I'm promoting the following approach in the company,
В нем вообще не рассматривают
and
вопрос штата и количество
I'm not speaking about the number of the people
должны что-то делать.
who have to do something
Я
in terms of security. I favor the approach
можно
when I try to
коллег, инженеров или не инженерных специальностей рассказать о безопасности,
tell as much as possible to engineers, developers, and others about the security threats,
они делают. И тем самым
and what may happen if they introduce certain changes.
понимание
And therefore,
угроз,
the understanding of threats, the understanding of risks
уровня
helps to achieve certain
содокладчик сейчас
security level. My core speaker is head of DevOps, and Alexander
проникся идеей безопасности, да, потому что
is very conscious of the security problems because he understands that CI/CD, this is not just a development context.
реализованные в CI/CD это не
The threats implemented in CI/CD
не являются последствиями только на процесс разработки, что не будет
does not affect the development only.
конкретно
For instance, that
конкретная команда не сможет изменения в коде внести.
certain team will not be able to introduce some changes in the code, but it may affect the whole IT landscape.
Ее приложение это и есть
And applications are the backbone of business of any IT company.
дополнить как DevOps.
Let me complement what's been said as DevOps. I think
должны повышать собственную
that DevOps themselves have to
security. Сегодня это
improve their qualification because security is not a standalone cybersecurity question. What I said, some regular training has to be done to the engineers, testers, developers. The basic
по безопасности
hygiene.
вопрос одного
This is not
одного человека.
just a good to have
Наших внутренних
thing.
процессов
This is a must-have for all our internal processes.
нужно,
What team is needed?
каждый был вовлечен в безопасность.
You don't need any team, just everyone has to be involved in the security of our products. And similar question from author about the time. And there is one more question from Artur as well.
Имеется в виду роли, которые нужно выделить для
What roles have to be dedicated to improve the security of CI/CD?
Смотрите, ну в CI/CD, вот
Look.
когда мы разговаривали об источнике угрозы,
When we were speaking about the sources of danger, we said that
оно такое абстрактное, потому что
developer, this is a very abstract thing because we mean IT specialists who have legitimate access to CI/CD.
те IT-специалисты,
And these are the IT specialists, what DevOps specialists,
разработчики, тестировщики,
engineers, testers.
круг лиц, которые
This is the range of people
CI/CD
who are working with CI/CD. This is the range of people
должен участвовать
who have to be involved in ensuring the safety and security.
Спрашивает, разрешаете ли вы
Question from Artyom. Do you allow to the developers to run pipelines manual or they run automatically? So this is both. Okay, thank you so much.
служебным положением задам вопрос от себя.
Let me abuse my role as a moderator.
На слайде с моделями угроз вы
On the slide with the threats models, you consider two types of criminals. These are the developers who have legitimate access to GitLab,
нарушители без доступа.
and there might be internal infringers that should not have access to CI/CD. The question is as follows.
Сознательно из этой модели или она как бы вне
Have you excluded from that model
вашего доклада нарушителя, который даже не внутренне является легитимным
violator
пользователем?
who is not even a legitimate internal user?
мы здесь, я говорил об этом, что мы когда смотрим
I said that when we look at the developer,
этого нарушителя,
we
который скомпрометировал
consider that
и
criminal or violator
это действие.
as someone who has compromised the developer. This is the external
К тому внутреннему,
criminal.
который скомпрометировал.
So it means that the external criminal is somehow connected to the compromised internal violator.
Источники угроз не рассматриваем,
Yep, we have not considered any other sources of threat.
компонентного состава CI/CD.
Out of the component composition of CI/CD, out of our realities and proceeding from other realities,
CI/CD не
we see that CI/CD
да, он все равно ограничен.
is not in a silo,
Сетевые доступы и
or rather it is, it has limited access.